In a city like New York, built on the bedrock of ambition and steel, value was a tangible thing, measured in stock prices, square footage, and the carat weight of the diamond on a fourth wife's finger. In this world, what was the worth of a simple memory? To Alistair Finch, a real estate titan whose name was carved into the skyline on a dozen buildings, a memory was a tool, a weapon, or a liability to be erased. He looked at Clara, the waitress refilling his water glass at the gilded cage, and saw less than a person. He saw a function, a pair of hands in motion. He assumed her quiet diligence was a sign of a simple mind, her uniform a summary of her entire existence. He decided, in a fit of boredom and casual cruelty, to make her the centerpiece of a little game for his associates. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. Alistair Finch did not know that the woman polishing his silverware possessed a mind like a vault, a memory so perfect it could reconstruct a man's entire life from the scraps he left behind. He wanted to prove she was unmemorable. Instead, he made himself unforgettable, for all the wrong reasons. The interior of the gilded cage was a symphony of hushed opulence. The air, thick with the scent of seared scallops, aged leather, and the subtle perfume of inherited wealth, was a carefully curated atmosphere. It was a place where deals that shaped the city were made over $8,000 bottles of Bordeaux, and the staff were trained to be as silent and unobtrusive as the gilded cherubs carved into the mahogany walls. Clara adjusted the crisp white cuff of her uniform. A dull ache had settled deep in the arches of her feet, a familiar companion after 10 hours of gliding over plush Persian rugs. At 26, with her dark hair pulled back in a severe, practical knot, and her features obscured by plain, functional glasses, Clara had mastered the art of invisibility. To the titans of industry who dined here, she was merely an extension of the table service. "Clara," hissed Mr. Dubois, the floor manager, his face a mask of anxious sweat. He gestured with a trembling hand from the service station. "Table 7. That's Alistair Finch. For the love of God, do not make a mistake." He sent the bread back because the crust was audibly arrogant. Clara took a slow, centering breath. Alistair Finch. The name was a brand, a legend, a 68-year-old predator who had started with his father's slum properties and built an empire of glass and concrete by devouring his competitors. He was known for his ruthless brilliance, his public philanthropy, and his private, venomous temper. She picked up a heavy silver tray, bearing a decanter of ruby-red wine, and approached the table. Finch sat at the circular booth like a king on a throne, flanked by 2 men. On his right was Marcus Thorne, his long-suffering chief counsel, a man in his late 40s whose expensive suit couldn't hide the exhaustion in his eyes. On his left was a younger, nervous man, an architect named Paul, clutching a rolled-up set of blueprints. Finch was holding court, his voice a low growl that effortlessly cut through the restaurant's murmur. "So I told the zoning board, 'Gentlemen, you can have a $5 million donation to your Community Arts Fund and a streamlined approval for the Hudson Spire, or you can have a 5-year audit of your personal finances. Your choice.' The permits were on my desk the next morning." Marcus managed a dry, practiced chuckle. "No one navigates the city like you, Alistair." Clara arrived at the table. "Good evening, gentlemen. The 1982 Petrus you requested." She moved with a fluid economy of motion, her hand steady as she began to pour the wine. She kept her gaze lowered, a part of the ritual of service. But Finch stopped talking. His pale, reptilian eyes weren't on the wine, they were on her. "Stop," he commanded. The word was not loud, but it had the weight of a dropped stone. Clara froze, the decanter hovering over his glass. "Marcus, look at this. A child's paw. She's agitating the tannins. The wine is supposed to breathe, not hyperventilate. He looked up at Clara, a smirk twisting his thin lips. This bottle, my dear, costs more than your college education, assuming you had one. Did they not teach you the basics at whatever back-alley academy trains you people? A flush of heat crept up Clara's neck. She had been pouring it perfectly. She had decanted hundreds of bottles more valuable than this one. He wasn't correcting her. He was performing. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice a soft murmur. She tilted the decanter a fraction of a degree, a meaningless adjustment to placate him. "I will be more careful." "See that you are," Finch sneered, turning his attention back to his companions. "It's the great tragedy of our time, isn't it? We're here discussing a project that will redefine the West Side, a billion-dollar feat of engineering, and we must rely on the cognitively disadvantaged to pour our drinks. It's a miracle they remember which end of the bottle to open." Paul, the young architect, shifted uncomfortably. "Alistair, she's just doing her job." "Poorly," Finch countered, taking a theatrical sip of the wine. He swirled it, then fixed his gaze on Clara again. She was still standing there, tray in hand, waiting to be dismissed. Her stillness, her lack of a flustered, tearful reaction, seemed to irritate him. He wanted a response, a crack in the facade. He wanted to prove his point, that she was nothing. "Tell me," Finch said, leaning forward, his voice dripping with condescension. "What is the most complex decision you've had to make today? Was it remembering that ice goes in the water, or was it the monumental challenge of tying your own shoes?" Marcus chuckled weakly, avoiding Clara's gaze. Clara's grip tightened on the cool metal of the tray. She needed this job, the mortgage on her mother's small house in Staten Island, the ever-growing pile of medical bills from her last hospital stay. They were a constant, heavy weight. She could not afford the luxury of anger. "My primary focus is ensuring our guests have a seamless and pleasant dining experience, Mr. Finch," she replied, her voice as smooth and neutral as polished glass. "How dreadfully boring," Finch sighed, waving a dismissive hand. "You see, Marcus, this is the fundamental divide in humanity. There are those who think and those who do, those who build empires and those who wipe down the tables within them. It's not about luck, it's about capacity." He waved her away. "Bring us the menus, and do try to concentrate. We wouldn't want you to forget our order." Clara turned and walked toward the kitchen. As she passed into the shadows of the service corridor, she finally allowed her face to tighten. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the tray. She wasn't just a waitress. What Alistair Finch couldn't possibly know was that 6 years ago, Clara wasn't serving wine. She was studying cryptography at Georgetown. She hadn't dropped out due to poor grades. She had been at the top of her class, a prodigy with a rare form of eidetic memory, recruited by the NSA for a fast-track analyst program. She left it all behind when her father, an independent building inspector, was financially ruined and professionally disgraced by a smear campaign after he refused to sign off on a structurally unsound skyscraper. The developer behind the project, the man who had anonymous proxies leak falsified reports of her father taking bribes, was Alistair Finch. Her father had lost his license, his reputation, and his will to live, dying of a heart attack less than a year later. Tonight, Alistair Finch wasn't just a monstrously rude customer. He was the architect of her family's destruction, and he was about to wander into a meticulously constructed memory palace he had no idea even existed. An hour later, as the main courses were being cleared, the tension at table 7 had escalated. Finch was berating the young architect, Paul, about the blueprints for the Hudson Spire. "This is unacceptable." Finch slammed his palm on the table, making the crystal glasses tremble. The load-bearing calculations for the central spire are lazy. You've over-engineered the foundation by 12%. That's $40 million in reinforced concrete I'm paying for, because your engineers are incompetent. I want it redrafted by morning. Mr. Finch, the city regulations require that level of support, especially with the alluvial soil composition near the river, Paul argued, his voice trembling. It's a safety margin. Safety is a line item on a budget, son. It can be adjusted, Finch roared. Clara approached to clear the plates, moving with practiced silence. Her ears, however, were anything but silent. She absorbed every word, every number. 12% over-engineering, 40 million, alluvial soil. These were not just words. They were data points, stored away in the vast, organized library of her mind. As she reached for Finch's plate, he suddenly grabbed her arm. The grip wasn't brutal, but it was firm and utterly unexpected. The low hum of the restaurant seemed to dip for a moment. "Let's have a little wager," Finch said, his eyes alight with a cruel, boorish energy. He was flushed with wine and power. He looked at Marcus, then at Paul, and finally his gaze settled on Clara. "Paul here thinks in details. Marcus thinks in legal loopholes. I think in patterns. I see the whole board. I'll prove to you that the average person can't even hold a single, complex piece of data in their head for 30 seconds. He looked up at Clara, his grip still on her arm. "You, Waitress. What's your name again?" "Clara, sir." "Clara," he repeated, as if tasting a foreign word. "I'm going to give you a chance to earn a tip that will change your year." He released her arm and reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, pulling out a thick, platinum money clip. He peeled off 20 crisp, $100 bills and slapped the stack onto the table. $2,000. A fortune for you, I imagine. "It's a very generous amount, sir," Clara said, her face a perfect, impassive mask. "It's yours," Finch continued, "if you can perform a simple task, a memory test, just to prove to my young friend here that not all minds are created equal." "Alistair, for heaven's sake, stop this," Marcus muttered, looking mortified. "Quiet, Marcus. This is an educational moment." He turned back to Clara. "Well, Clara, are you game?" Clara looked at the money. It would cover her mother's next 3 mortgage payments. She looked at Alistair Finch's smug, arrogant face, the face of the man who had destroyed her father for questioning his calculations. "What is the task, sir?" she asked. Finch smiled, a predator's smile. He leaned back. "I am going to recite a string of numbers and letters. It is the serial number for a piece of proprietary software we are developing. It's 32 characters long. I will say it once. You will then have 10 seconds of silence before you repeat it back to me. Perfectly. No mistakes." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You see, I bet Paul here a case of this Petru that you couldn't do it. He, in his bleeding heart liberalism, thinks you can." He cleared his throat and began to speak, his voice clear and steady. 84KJ77TR1130 CHF90L P22VN C5XRB6T3Z. He finished and leaned back, crossing his arms with a triumphant look. The silence at the table was absolute. Other diners were beginning to stare. Mr. Dubois hovered near the service station, wringing his hands, looking as if he might faint. To anyone else, it was a meaningless jumble of characters, impossible to retain. To Clara, it was like listening to a short, simple melody. The characters flowed into her mind, not as a list to be memorized, but as a single, complete image. She saw them, hanging in the air before her, crisp and clear. But she saw something else, too. In her Georgetown cryptography classes, They had studied legacy encryption algorithms used by Swiss banks in the 1990s. The alphanumeric structure Finch had recited. It wasn't random. The grouping, the position of the letters relative to the numbers. It was a perfect match for a deprecated, but still functional key generation algorithm for a specific Zurich-based financial institution. And the block of characters in the middle, F90LP, wasn't a serial number component. It was a routing code. The 10 seconds were up. "Well?" Finch mocked. "Did the gears grind to a halt? Do you need me to hum it for you?" Clara met his gaze for the first time that evening. Her eyes, magnified slightly by her glasses, were clear and steady. She took a small breath. 84KJ77, TR1130CHF90L, P22VN C5XR B6T3Z, she recited, her voice calm and even, without a single hesitation. A flicker of surprise crossed Finch's face, quickly replaced by annoyance. Paul, the architect, let out a relieved sigh. Marcus stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. "Well, I'll be damned," Finch grumbled, reaching for the money. "Looks like you win your tip, girl. A trained parrot could—" "That's not a software serial number, sir," Clara said, her voice cutting through his. The table went silent again. Finch froze, his hand hovering over the cash. "What did you say?" "The sequence you recited," Clara continued, her voice gaining a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the space around their table. "It's not a random string. It's a key generated by a Cantone-Heiss variant algorithm. The CH in the middle is the giveaway. It was used almost exclusively by the Zurich Cantonal Bank for high-value offshore transfers in the late 90s. The initial 84K block designates the account type as a legacy trust, and the final T3Z is a transaction signifier." She paused, letting the words sink in. Marcus Thorne's face had gone from exhausted to ashen. Paul looked utterly bewildered. Alistair Finch's smug expression had vanished, replaced by a stony, dangerous stillness. Clara took one step closer to the table, her voice dropping so only they could hear. "And the block in the middle, F90LP, isn't part of the key. It's a reference code. F90 for fiscal year 1990. LP for liquidation protocol. It's the routing number for the payment made to a shell corporation that purchased the assets of 3 construction firms that went bankrupt after unfortunate accidents on their work sites. All of them were competitors for the original Finch Tower project." She looked directly into Alistair Finch's cold, furious eyes. "It's not a software key. It's a 30-year-old piece of blood money, sir." The silence that followed was not empty. It was a screaming void. Marcus Thorne slowly picked up his water glass, his hand trembling so violently that water sloshed onto the pristine white tablecloth. He knew. He knew exactly what she was talking about. He had drafted the paperwork for those shell corporations. Alistair Finch sat perfectly still, his face a granite mask of fury. The game was over. He hadn't just been beaten, he had been dissected, exposed by the waitress he had tried to humiliate. The numbers he had used as a tool of mockery, chosen from a long-dead account he thought no one could possibly recognize, had become a confession. Clara didn't wait for a response. She reached out, her hand steady, and picked up the stack of $2,000 from the table. "Thank you for the tip, sir," she said, her voice returning to its professional, quiet tone. "And you were right about the wine. One should always allow it to breathe properly before serving." She tucked the money into her apron pocket. "I'll bring your check. I trust you can handle the basic arithmetic." She turned and walked away, her back straight, her steps measured. She could feel Alistair Finch's stare burning into her back, a look that promised not defeat, but annihilation. She hadn't just won a bet. She had declared war. A man like Alistair Finch didn't lose. He levelled the playing field until he was the only one left standing, and Clara had just handed him a blueprint of exactly where to dig the foundations of her ruin. The penthouse office of Finch Enterprises was a glass and chrome sanctuary suspended 50 stories above the city. From here, Manhattan was a silent, glittering map of Alistair Finch's dominion. But tonight, the view offered no comfort. He wasn't sleeping. He was seething. On his vast obsidian desk, next to a glass of untouched Macallan 30, lay a single sheet of paper. On it, Marcus Thorne had written down the 32-character sequence from memory, the sequence the waitress had not only recalled, but had forensically deconstructed. "It's impossible," Finch muttered for the 10th time, his voice a low growl. He wasn't talking about her memory. He was talking about her knowledge. The Cantonais algorithm was an arcane piece of financial history. The reference code was buried in 3 decades of sealed legal documents. For her to know that, it wasn't a lucky guess. It was an attack. The intercom on his desk buzzed. "Mr. Finch, Mr. Thorne is here with the preliminary report you requested." "Send him in," Finch snapped. Marcus Thorne entered, looking even more haggard than he had at the restaurant. He held a slim digital tablet, placing it on the desk with the reluctance of a man handling an unexploded bomb. "You're not going to like this, Alistair. I already don't like it," Finch spat. "Who is she? Is she SEC? FBI? A plant from a competitor?" "No," Marcus said quietly. "She's worse. She's a ghost with a grudge. Her name is Clara Rossi. The name didn't ring any bells until I cross-referenced it with old litigation files. Her father was Arthur Rossi." Finch went still. Rossi. The name was a faint echo from a battle won long ago. "The inspector," he finally said. "The one who tried to hold up the first Finch Tower over some nonsense about steel-weld integrity." "The very same," Marcus nodded grimly. "After you discredited him, he lost everything. Died a year later. The daughter, Clara, was apparently some kind of prodigy. Full scholarship to Georgetown, studying cryptanalysis and pattern recognition. On track for a career at the NSA. She dropped out the semester after her father died. Vanished from public record, until she turned up serving sea bass at the Gilded Cage." Finch stared out the window. The rage began to cool, replaced by a chilling, predatory clarity. A slow, reptilian smile crept onto his face. "So," he murmured. "The little mouse wasn't just hiding. She was waiting." "She humiliated you, Alistair," Marcus warned. "She did it in front of a key architect and your own counsel. If a story like this leaks, Billionaire exposed by Waitress, it makes you look weak. We need to make this go away. Pay her off. A non-disclosure agreement." "No," Finch said, his eyes glinting. "You don't pay off an infestation. You exterminate it." He picked up his phone. "Get me Dubois at the Gilded Cage. I don't care what time it is. Tell him his lease is up for review, and his continued tenancy depends entirely on his cooperation over the next 12 hours. "Alistair, what are you planning?" Marcus asked, a note of genuine fear in his voice. "I'm going to teach Miss Rossi a lesson her brilliant father never learned," Finch sneered. "Intelligence is a parlor trick. Power is reality. She thinks she won the game. I'm about to burn the entire board." The next evening, Clara arrived for her shift, feeling a cold knot of apprehension in her stomach. The $2,000 was a temporary shield, not a solution. It bought time, but she knew a man like Finch wouldn't let such a public challenge go unanswered. As she walked through the service entrance, The usual pre-dinner cacophony of the kitchen was absent. The chefs stood silently by their stations. The dishwashers avoided her eyes. The air was thick with a tense, fearful silence. "Rossi!" Mr. Dubois' voice boomed from the doorway to the main dining room. He stood there, flanked by 2 uniformed security guards, and leaning against the host stand, looking utterly relaxed, was Alistair Finch. Clara's heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her face a calm, neutral mask. "Is something wrong, Mr. Dubois?" "I'm afraid so," Dubois said, his voice slick with false regret. He refused to meet her gaze. "There's been a theft, a rather significant one." "A theft?" Clara asked, though she already knew. "Indeed," Alistair Finch said, stepping forward. His handmade leather shoes made no sound on the polished floor. "After our enlightening conversation last night, I returned home to find I was missing something. A valuable family heirloom, a vintage Patek Philippe watch, left on the table in a moment of carelessness." Clara's blood ran cold. "That's absurd. I cleared your table. There was no watch." "Really?" Finch raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Because we reviewed the security footage. It's grainy, but it shows you putting something in your apron pocket as you cleared the final plates. Something small and metallic." He gestured to the guards. "We took the liberty of searching your locker." One of the guards stepped forward, holding a clear evidence bag. Inside, nestled amongst a spare pair of shoes and a paperback novel, was a stunning, gold Patek Philippe watch. "You planted that," Clara said, her voice shaking with a rage that burned away her fear. She looked at Dubois. "Mr. Dubois, you know me. You know I would never steal anything." "The police have been called," Finch interrupted smoothly. "Grand larceny. Given the value of the watch, that's a felony, Clara. A few years in prison. It seems a penchant for crime runs in your family, doesn't it? Like father, like daughter." The reference to her father was a deliberate, twisting knife. This wasn't about a watch. This was about total annihilation. "However," Finch continued, adjusting his tie, "I am not a monster. I believe in second chances." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper meant only for her. "I will tell the police it was a misunderstanding. I will not press charges. But you are fired, and I will personally see to it that your name is blacklisted at every restaurant, hotel, and catering company in this city. You will not so much as wash a dish in a back-alley diner. Your life in this town is over. You are erased." He stepped back, his voice rising again for the benefit of the silent, watching staff. "Now, get your things and leave, before I change my mind." Clara looked at Dubois, who was staring intently at a scuff mark on his shoe. She looked at her fellow waiters, their faces a mixture of pity and terror. They were all trapped in Finch's web. She was alone. With deliberate, measured movements, she untied the strings of her apron. Her hands were steady now, fueled by a cold, crystalline fury. She let the apron drop to the floor. "You think this is over," Clara said, her voice quiet, but carrying the force of a breaking storm. "You think because you own the buildings, you own the truth." Finch laughed, a short, ugly sound. "My dear girl, I don't own the truth. I manufacture it. It's much more profitable." Clara adjusted her glasses, her eyes locking onto his. "Every system, Mr. Finch, no matter how complex, has a point of failure. A single variable that can cause a total collapse." She gave him a small, chilling smile. "You just made me that variable." She turned and walked out the back door into the grimy alley, not looking back. The heavy door slammed shut behind her, a final metallic punctuation mark. Clara Rossi was done being invisible. She was done serving. The game had begun. For 3 days, Clara existed in a state of suspended animation, a ghost in her own small apartment in Queens. The peeling paint and the clanking radiator were a world away from the gilded cage she had just been expelled from. On her kitchen table, next to a stack of her mother's unpaid medical bills, sat her old laptop, a relic from her Georgetown days. It was slow and battered, but the mind connected to it was not. Alistair Finch believed he had won. By cutting off her livelihood, he thought he had rendered her powerless, another piece of human debris in the city's gutters. He had forgotten what she was. She wasn't a waitress who was good at memorizing things. She was a cryptanalyst. She saw the world as a series of interconnected systems, codes to be broken, patterns to be identified. And Finch's empire, for all its seeming invincibility, was just another system. She had spent 72 hours fueled by black coffee and cold fury, not sleeping, but diving. She dove into the deep web, into public records, into archived financial news, cross-referencing every deal, every subsidiary, every lawsuit connected to Finch Enterprises for the past 30 years. She was building a map, not of his successes, but of his methods. Her eidetic memory, once a tool for academic excellence, was now a weapon. She could recall entire pages of legal documents she had only glanced at years ago while helping her father, connecting names and dates that no normal person would ever link. The key, she knew, was the Hudson Spire project, Finch's crown jewel, his legacy. It had to be as dirty as everything else he'd ever built. On the 4th day, she found it, a tiny crack in the foundation. It was a notice of a pending environmental impact report buried on a sub-page of the City Planning Commission's website. The report was being conducted by a small independent firm called Terra Veritas. It was due in 2 weeks. An aggressive project like the Spire, built on reclaimed land by the river, would live or die by that report. She picked up a cheap burner phone she'd bought for cash. She dialed the number for Terra Veritas. A weary-sounding woman answered. "Terra Veritas, this is Dr. Arris." "Dr. Arris," Clara said, her voice calm and professional. "My name is Clara. I'm a freelance risk assessment consultant. I believe Alistair Finch is about to either bribe you or destroy you to get the environmental report he wants for the Hudson Spire." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "Who is this? How did you get this number?" "I'm the person who knows Finch's playbook," Clara said. "I know he's pressuring you to ignore the soil contamination readings from the old industrial site. I also know your firm is 3 months behind on its debt payments to Sterling Bank, a bank Finch acquired a controlling interest in 6 months ago. He's not going to bribe you, Doctor. He's going to call in your loans and bankrupt you on Monday, then have a more cooperative firm take over the report." The silence stretched longer, heavier. "My God," Dr. Orris whispered. "We got the notice from the bank an hour ago. They're calling the loan. How could you possibly know that?" "Because that's the pattern," Clara said. "He doesn't leave witnesses. He creates victims. But I have a way to break the pattern. I need to meet you. I have data that will make your report unignorable, data that will stop the Hudson Spire cold." "Why would you do this? What do you want?" Clara looked at a small, faded photograph of her father, pinned to the corkboard above her desk. "I want to see something built on a foundation of truth for a change." They agreed to meet. An hour later, Clara sat in a booth in a noisy diner in the Bronx, far from the prying eyes of Midtown. Dr. Evelyn Arris was a woman in her 50s, with intelligent, worried eyes, and hands stained with what looked like actual soil. Clara didn't waste time. She opened her laptop. "Finch thinks he's covered his tracks," Clara began, pulling up a series of geological surveys from the 1980s she'd unearthed from a university's digital archive. "But he's only hidden the recent data. Look here. This is the original survey of the site before the old chemical plant was demolished. The levels of hexavalent chromium in the groundwater were 200 times the legal limit. The plant's owners declared bankruptcy, and the site was sold for $1 to a shell company." She clicked another key, bringing up a corporate registration document. A shell company, Hudson Development Group, whose sole listed director was a 28-year-old Alistair Finch. Dr. Harris stared at the screen, her face paling. He didn't just build on a toxic site. He owned it. He buried the original sin. He buried it under 30 feet of landfill and 30 years of paperwork, Clara said. But the poison is still there. If you sink the pylons for a skyscraper that size, you will displace that contaminated groundwater into the Hudson River. It would be an environmental disaster of unprecedented scale. Your current soil samples are shallow. He's counting on that. You need to take deep core samples, and you need to do it now, before he shuts you down. He'll fight it, Aris said, her voice shaking. He'll bury us in court. Not if we go public first, Clara said. She slid a flash drive across the table. On this drive is every piece of data I just showed you, plus a full breakdown of the shell company's history, linking it directly back to Finch. Leak it. Send it to every independent news blogger, every environmental agency, every member of the city council. Don't send it to the major networks. Finch owns them. Create a storm he can't control. Dr. Harris looked from the flash drive to Clara, a new light of determination in her eyes. He picked a fight with the wrong woman. No, Clara said with a small, grim smile. He picked a fight with the wrong 2 women. The story broke on a Tuesday. It wasn't a headline in the major papers, but a swarm of blog posts, a flurry of tweets, a cascade of outrage from environmental groups. By noon, L'arpusoho Finch's poison pillar was trending. By 3 o'clock, the city council had called an emergency session. By 5, the EPA had announced a federal investigation, and a stop work order was issued for the Hudson Spire construction site. Inside his penthouse office, Alistair Finch was a caged animal. He hurled a crystal paperweight against the wall, where it shattered with a satisfyingly expensive crash. "How?" he roared at Marcus Thorne. "How did she find this? That shell company was dissolved 25 years ago. The records were supposed to be sealed." "She's not playing by the rules, Alistair," Marcus said, his voice strained. He had aged 5 years in the last week. "She's not filing lawsuits or seeking damages. She's using information as a weapon. She's detonating logic bombs under your entire empire." "Then find her," Finch bellowed. "I want her found. I want her silenced." "It's too late for that," Marcus said quietly, gesturing to the television. On the screen, a press conference was taking place on the steps of City Hall. A coalition of environmental activists, led by Dr. Evelyn Aris, was speaking to a massive crowd of reporters. And standing just behind Dr. Aris, not speaking but visible to every camera, was a calm young woman in a simple dark blazer, her hair down, her glasses glinting in the flash of the cameras. It was Clara. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was putting a face to the data. She was showing Alistair Finch that she was not just a variable. She was the equation he could no longer solve. The loss of the Hudson Spire project did not chasten Alistair Finch. It unhinged him. The project wasn't just a building. It was to be his monument, the final, gleaming testament to his power. Its collapse, orchestrated by a woman he considered less than nothing, was an existential threat. His public image, carefully cultivated over decades, was crumbling. His investors were getting nervous. The federal investigation was no longer just about environmental negligence. It was expanding, looking into the very financial structures he had used to hide the toxic land deal. Finch realized his mistake. He had been fighting Clara on her terms, in the shadows of data and information. It was time to drag her into his arena, the world of brute force and public spectacle. He called a press conference of his own, not in a boardroom, but on the half-finished, now silent construction site of the spire itself. With the skeletal steel frame as his backdrop, he played the victim. "This city is under attack," he thundered into a phalanx of microphones, his face a mask of righteous indignation. Not by foreign powers, but by a domestic terrorist, a radicalized anarchist named Clara Rossi, a woman with a documented history of instability, is waging a campaign of lies and slander to destroy the progress and prosperity this project represents. She has hacked, stolen, and fabricated documents to create a false narrative. This isn't about the environment, it's about extortion. He had no proof, but in the world of media, the accusation was the story. He was painting her as a dangerous, unhinged criminal. He was turning his immense resources toward her personal destruction. In the modest, temporary offices of Terra Veritas, Clara and Dr. Aris watched the broadcast. Dr. Aris was pale. "He's going to ruin you, Clara. He'll invent a criminal record. He'll have people testify against you. He can create any reality he wants." Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the man on the screen. He was predictable. His rage was making him sloppy. "He thinks he's cornered me," she said softly. "He doesn't realize he's just shown me his last move." She turned to her laptop. There was one person left who knew where all the real bodies were buried. One person who was as much a prisoner of Finch as she had been. She sent a single, encrypted email. The recipient was Marcus Thorne. The subject line was blank. The body of the email contained just one line of text: 84KJ77, TR1130, CHF90L, P22VNC5XR B6T3Z. An hour later, her burner phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. "How dare you send that to me?" Marcus Thorne's voice was a ragged whisper, laced with panic. "Do you know what he would do if he knew?" "I know what he's already done," Clara replied calmly. "To my father, to Dr. Aris, to you. You're his lawyer, Mr. Thorne, but you're also his longest-serving victim. You clean up his messes, you bury his crimes, and in return, he lets you live in a beautiful cage. You don't know anything about me. I know that on May 12th, 2018, you drafted the memo that falsified the safety reports for the Grenfell Tower renovation project, the one where Finch Enterprises used substandard, flammable cladding to save $7 million. I know you advised him to do it. I also know your son is attending Yale, and his entire tuition is paid for by a scholarship fund that is anonymously endowed by Alistair Finch. He doesn't just own your career, Mr. Thorne. He owns your son's future." There was a choked sound on the other end of the line. Clara's memory wasn't just for numbers. She remembered every document, every footnote, every overheard conversation from the hours she spent researching. "He's going to destroy me," Marcus whispered. "He already has," Clara said, her voice softening slightly. "The question is whether you're going to let him destroy anyone else. I don't want you to testify. I don't want you to be a whistleblower. I just want one thing, the key to his real office." His real office? His office is on the 50th floor. "No," Clara said. "That's his showroom, the one where he performs. I'm talking about the other one, the one he had built in the 1980s, the one with the lead-lined walls and the analog-only security system. The one where he keeps the real files, the paper files, the ones that predate the digital age, the ones that prove everything. Marcus was silent for a full minute. The sound of his breathing was heavy, labored. "Why should I help you? He'll ruin me." "Because you have a choice," Clara said. "You can be the man who helped Alistair Finch, or you can be the man who stopped him. Your son will find out who his father is one day. Which one do you want him to see?" She gave him an address and a time. "Be there, or don't. It's your move." She hung up the phone. She had laid out the variables. Now, all she could do was wait and see how the equation would resolve. 2 nights later, under the cloak of a torrential thunderstorm, a lone figure stood across the street from a drab, anonymous office building in the financial district. It was a property owned by Finch, but his name was nowhere on it. Clara pulled the collar of her raincoat tighter, her eyes fixed on the entrance. She had no idea if Marcus would show. She had offered him a chance at redemption, but she knew fear was a powerful cage. At precisely 2:00 a.m., a black car pulled up. Marcus Thorne got out, his face pale and grim in the flashing streetlights. He didn't look at her. He walked to a nearby trash can, dropped a small, plain manila envelope inside, and then got back in the car, which sped away into the rain. He had made his choice. Clara retrieved the envelope. Inside was a single old-fashioned brass key and a handwritten note. "Sub-basement B room 007. The alarm is on a 60-second delay triggered by the door. You won't have long. Good luck." This was it. The final move. Finch was preparing for a legal and media war, a war of attrition. He would never expect a direct physical assault on the heart of his empire, his own personal time capsule of crime. The courtroom was a media circus. It wasn't a criminal trial, but a preliminary hearing for the $2 billion defamation lawsuit Alistair Finch had filed against Clara Rossi. It was a show trial, designed to publicly brand her as a liar and bankrupt her with legal fees. Finch sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by a team of 6 ruthless lawyers, looking calm and powerful. Clara sat alone at the defendant's table. She had waived her right to counsel. She was representing herself. Finch's lead lawyer, a shark named Silas Grant, spent 3 hours methodically assassinating Clara's character. He brought up her dropping out of Georgetown, framing it as an expulsion for academic dishonesty. He produced a falsified psychiatric evaluation, claiming she suffered from paranoid delusions. He painted her as a vengeful, unstable woman, obsessed with a baseless family grudge. Then it was Clara's turn. "Ms. Rossi," the judge said, her tone weary, "do you wish to make an opening statement?" "No, Your Honor," Clara said, standing. Her voice was steady, clear. "I would simply like to present my evidence regarding the plaintiff's claims of my unstable character and baseless grudge." Silas Grant shot to his feet. "Objection. She has no evidence. This is a delaying tactic." "On the contrary," Clara said, turning to the bailiff and handing him a set of thick, bound documents. "I have a great deal of evidence. I would like to submit into the Record Exhibit A." She looked directly at Alistair Finch. "A certified copy of the original coroner's report for my father, Arthur Rossi, which was suppressed at the time of his death. It notes the cause of death as a massive coronary event, brought on by extreme psychological distress." Finch's jaw tightened. "Exhibit B," Clara continued, her voice gaining strength. "A sworn affidavit from my father's former secretary, detailing a campaign of harassment and threats made against him by anonymous callers in the weeks leading up to his death. And Exhibit C." She paused, letting the room hang on her words. She held up a single, yellowed piece of paper in a plastic sleeve. "This is an internal memo, dated October 1993, from Finch Enterprises. It is written and signed by Mr. Finch himself." She looked at the judge. "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to read a short passage." The judge nodded, intrigued. Silas Grant was frantically whispering to Finch, who was waving him off, a look of disbelief on his face. He thought all copies of that memo had been destroyed. Clara read, her voice ringing through the silent courtroom. "The Rossi problem is becoming a liability. We cannot proceed with the tower as long as this sanctimonious little inspector refuses to be reasonable. I have authorized Marcus to apply pressure. If that doesn't work, we move to the next phase. Bury him. Bury his reputation. Bury his finances. And if need be, bury him in the foundation. This tower will be built." A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Reporters were typing furiously. Alistair Finch's face had turned a mottled, purplish red. He was staring at the memo in her hand, as if it were a ghost. "Objection!" Grant screamed. "That document is a forgery. It's inadmissible." "It's no forgery," Clara said calmly. "It was recovered 2 nights ago from a secure, climate-controlled file room in sub-basement B of the plaintiff's property at 114 Pearl Street. Along with these." She gestured to the bailiff, who began distributing the other bound documents to the judge and Finch's legal team. They were thick volumes. "These are the complete, unredacted files on the Hudson Spire land deal, the Grenfell Tower renovation, and the liquidation of the 3 construction firms in 1990, all of them containing Mr. Finch's handwritten notes in the margins, detailing methods of bribery, witness intimidation, and collusion. It seems Mr. Finch is a man who likes to keep trophies of his victories." Alistair Finch lunged to his feet, his composure finally shattering. "Lies! She broke into my private property. She's a thief, a criminal." "Mr. Finch, sit down," the judge commanded, banging her gavel. She was no longer looking at Clara with pity. She was looking at Finch with cold fury. "She's the one who should be on trial," Finch raged, pointing a trembling finger at Clara. "I built this city. I own this city. A little gutter snipe like you thinks she can tear it all down with a few pieces of old paper? I will crush you. I will ruin you until you beg for the mercy of death." He had confessed, not to a specific crime, but to a mindset, to a belief that he was above the law, above decency, above humanity. In his rage, he had shown the entire world exactly who he was. The judge stared at him, her face grim. "Mr. Finch, you have just threatened a defendant in open court. You have confirmed the existence of the documents in question, and you have displayed a contempt for this court that I haven't seen in my 30 years on the bench." She turned to the federal marshals standing by the wall. "Marshals, take Mr. Finch into custody. He is to be held on charges of contempt and witness tampering. The SEC and the District Attorney's Office will be notified immediately. This hearing is adjourned." As the marshals approached a stunned and sputtering Alistair Finch, he looked past them, his eyes locking with Clara's. He looked small, pathetic, a king suddenly stripped of his crown and robes. "You," he whispered, his voice hoarse with hatred. "You did this!" Clara stood her ground, her expression unreadable. "No, Mr. Finch," she said, her voice just loud enough for him to hear over the chaos. "You built this. I just remembered the address." The empire of Alistair Finch didn't crumble. It evaporated. The documents from his secret archive were a Rosetta Stone of corruption, unlocking decades of criminal activity. The ensuing federal investigation was a cascade of indictments, frozen assets, and public disgrace. Finch, denied bail, traded his penthouse for a federal holding cell, his bespoke suits for an orange jumpsuit. His name, once a symbol of power, became a byword for corporate evil. But for Clara, the victory was not in his downfall. It was in the quiet aftermath. The world moved on, as it always does. The news cycle found new villains. The story of the waitress who toppled a titan faded into a curious piece of local law. And that was exactly how she wanted it. With a portion of the settlement she received from the class action lawsuit filed by the victims of Finch's many schemes, she paid off her mother's medical debts and bought the small house they had been renting for years. She didn't want a life in the spotlight. She didn't want to be a CEO or a public figure. She wanted peace. 6 months after the trial, on a crisp autumn afternoon, a black car pulled up in front of Sachlère the Gilded Cage. The restaurant had survived the scandal, but barely. Under new anonymous ownership, it was struggling to regain its former glory. Mr. Dubois, the manager, was more anxious than ever, a man perpetually terrified of failure. He saw the car and immediately went into a practiced subservient crouch, rushing to open the door. "Welcome. Welcome to the Gilded Cage," he chirped, his eyes on the expensive shoes stepping onto the pavement. "We are honored by your visit. Your table is prepared." He looked up, and the professional smile froze on his face, cracking like cheap plaster. Standing before him was Clara. She was not in a uniform. She wore a simple but elegant navy blue dress, her hair cut in a stylish, professional bob. She looked different, rested, confident, serene. "Clara," Dubois stammered, stumbling backward. What are you doing here? If you're looking for your job back, I'm afraid." Clara gave a small, gentle laugh. "I'm not here for a job, Mr. Dubois. I'm here for a reservation." She walked past him into the familiar, opulent dining room. "Table for 2, under the name Rossi." Dubois stared, utterly bewildered. "But who are you with?" "My mother," Clara said, gesturing to the car, where an elderly woman with a kind, tired face was now being helped out by the driver. "It's her first time in a restaurant like this. We're celebrating." "Celebrating what?" Dubois asked, his mind reeling. Clara walked over to table 7, the very table where her war with Finch had begun. She ran a hand over the smooth, polished wood. "Today, the Vance Foundation officially opened its doors," she said quietly. "It provides pro bono legal and investigative services for people who have been victims of corporate fraud. It's funded by an anonymous donor." She turned to look at him, her eyes clear and direct. "My father's name was Arthur. He was a good man who believed in doing things the right way. I thought it was time his name was associated with building something up instead of being torn down." Dubois was speechless. He saw now that he had never really seen her at all. He had seen a uniform, a function, a subordinate. He had failed to see the person inside it. It was the same mistake Finch had made, just on a smaller, more pathetic scale. Your table, Mr. Rossi," he finally managed, gesturing to the best table in the house, the one by the window overlooking the park. "No, thank you," Clara said with a polite smile. "We'll take this one." She gestured to table 7. "The view is perfect from here." As she sat down, helping her mother into the plush booth, she caught her reflection in the polished silver. She saw a woman who had walked through fire and emerged, not hardened, but whole. Alistair Finch had been right about one thing. The world was divided. But not between the powerful and the weak, or the rich and the poor. It was divided between those who build and those who break. He was a breaker. He had broken her father. He had tried to break her. And in the end, he had only succeeded in breaking himself. The waiter, a nervous young man, approached their table. "Good afternoon, madam." May I pour you some water?" "Yes, thank you," Clara said. As he filled her glass, a single drop of water splashed onto the tablecloth. The young man flushed with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, Mum," he stammered. Clara reached out and patted his arm gently. "It's just water," she said, her voice kind. "Don't worry about it. We all make mistakes." And in that small act of grace, in that quiet corner of a gilded cage she had once served in, Clara Rossi found the one thing Alistair Finch, with all his billions, could never buy: a final, lasting peace.